The dust settled over Redemption Creek like a shroud every evening, painting the wooden buildings in shades of amber and rust. It was a town like any other scattered across the Wyoming Territory in the summer of 1873, where cattle ruled the economy and men ruled everything else. The saloon doors swung open and closed with the rhythm of desperate hearts seeking comfort in whiskey and company, while the general store stood as a monument to civilization's stubborn foothold in this unforgiving land. But for all its pretense of progress, Redemption Creek remained a place where judgment came swift and cruel, especially for those who dared to be different. Sarah Whitmore knew this truth better than most. She walked down the main street with her head held high despite the weight of 1,000 cruel stares, her boots kicking up little clouds of dirt with each determined step. Her face bore the unmistakable marks of a childhood fever that had ravaged her left cheek, leaving behind scars that twisted the skin from her eye to her jaw. Her hair, though clean and carefully braided, held none of the golden sheen that the town's eligible ladies possessed. Instead, it hung in mousy brown strands that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her frame was thin, almost fragile, the result of years spent working harder than her body could sustain on her father's struggling ranch. The laughter started the moment she passed the saloon. It always did. 3 cowboys lounged against the hitching post, their faces flushed with afternoon drinking. The tallest one, a man named Jackson with a scar across his knuckles and cruelty in his eyes, nudged his companions and spoke loud enough for half the street to hear. "Well, look what the buzzards dragged in. Scarface Sarah gracing us with her presence again." His friends erupted in laughter, slapping their thighs as if he had delivered the wittiest observation ever spoken. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept walking. She had learned long ago that responding only fed their appetite for her humiliation. Better to be stone, to be wind, to be anything but the wounded creature they wanted her to be. "Hey, Sarah," Jackson called after her, emboldened by her silence. "My horse needs someone to brush him down. You got a face perfect for scaring off the flies." More laughter. It echoed off the buildings and seemed to multiply in the air around her. Sarah felt the familiar burn behind her eyes, the pressure of tears she refused to shed in public. Not here. Not where they could see. She clutched her small basket tighter and hurried toward the general store, where at least Mrs. Henderson treated her with a measure of dignity. But before she could reach the store's steps, a woman's voice joined the chorus of mockery. Margaret Sullivan stood in the doorway of the dress shop, her perfect ringlets catching the sunlight, her expensive dress imported all the way from St. Louis. She was the banker's daughter, blessed with beauty and wealth, cursed with a heart as barren as winter soil. "Honestly, Sarah, don't you think it's cruel to inflict that face on decent people trying to enjoy their day? Perhaps you should do your shopping after dark." The women flanking Margaret giggled behind their gloved hands, their eyes sparkling with the particular joy that comes from feeling superior to another human being. Sarah stopped walking. Something in her chest cracked just a little, the way ice cracks before it shatters completely. She turned to face Margaret, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I have as much right to walk this street as anyone, Miss Sullivan. The good Lord made me as I am, and I reckon if he has no complaints, neither should you." Margaret's face flushed red, unused to being confronted by someone she considered beneath contempt. She opened her mouth to deliver what would surely be a devastating retort, but she never got the chance. "Mom's got a point." The voice was quiet, barely more than a rumble, but it cut through the tension like a knife through butter. Every head on the street turned toward the speaker. He stood in the shadow of the blacksmith's awning, a tall man with shoulders broad as a barn door and hands that looked like they could break stone or cradle a bird's egg with equal capability. His hat was pulled low, obscuring much of his face, but beneath its brim, keen blue eyes watched the scene with an intensity that made several onlookers shift uncomfortably. Nobody knew much about the man they called Dalton. He had ridden into Redemption Creek 3 months prior, taken a job as a ranch hand at the sprawling Cross T Ranch north of town, and proceeded to become something of a local legend for 2 reasons: his almost supernatural skill with horses and his near-complete silence. He spoke perhaps 10 words a day, if that, and never socialized in the saloon or attended church socials. He worked from dawn until dusk, kept to himself, and somehow commanded respect through sheer competence and an aura of quiet strength that made even the loudest men think twice before crossing him. Now he stepped out of the shadows, his boots making soft sounds against the wooden boardwalk. He walked with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin, unhurried and unafraid. He stopped directly between Sarah and Margaret's group, his presence creating an invisible barrier that felt as solid as a stone wall. "Pretty sure the lady wasn't asking for commentary on her appearance," Dalton said, his voice still quiet but carrying clearly in the sudden hush. "Might be best if folks remembered their manners." Jackson pushed off from the hitching post, his hand dropping instinctively toward the revolver at his hip. "This ain't your business, horse wrangler. We're just having a bit of fun." Dalton turned his head slowly to regard Jackson, and something in his gaze made the cowboy's hand freeze halfway to his weapon. "Don't look like fun to me. Looks like cowardice. Takes a real brave man to mock a woman half his size." The sarcasm in his tone was unmistakable. Jackson's face turned purple with rage, but before he could respond, the sheriff emerged from his office down the street. Sheriff Craddock was a tired old man who had seen too much violence in his years and had no patience for more. He read the situation in an instant and made his way toward the gathering crowd with wary determination. "That's enough," Craddock announced, his hand resting on his own gun as a reminder of the law's authority. "Jackson, you and your boys find somewhere else to waste your time. Miss Sullivan, I'm sure you have better things to do than block the walkway. And Miss Whitmore, please go about your business. Show's over, folks." The crowd dispersed reluctantly, like children called in from play. Sarah found herself standing alone on the street with Dalton, who had removed his hat and was turning it slowly in his hands. Up close, she could see his face more clearly. He was younger than his bearing suggested, perhaps 30, with weathered skin that spoke of years under the sun and a nose that had been broken at least once. But his eyes held a depth of kindness that Sarah had rarely encountered. "Thank you," she said softly, unsure what else to say. "You didn't have to do that." Dalton shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Couldn't stand by and watch. Wouldn't be right." He paused, seeming to struggle with something, then added, "Name's Dalton. Dalton Cross, Sarah Whitmore." She held out her hand, half expecting him to ignore it. Instead, he took it gently, his calloused palm warm against hers. The handshake lasted only a moment, but something passed between them in that brief contact, a recognition that neither could quite name. "Pleasure, Miss Whitmore." He placed his hat back on his head and tipped it to her. "You take care now." He walked away before she could respond, his long strides carrying him toward the livery stable, where his horse presumably waited. Sarah stood watching him go, her heart doing strange things in her chest, beating in rhythm she didn't recognize. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something besides resignation and sorrow. She felt seen. The weeks that followed brought an unexpected change to Sarah's routine. She noticed Dalton around town more frequently, though he seemed to materialize only when she happened to be present. When Jackson and his friends started their usual mockery outside the dry goods store, Dalton appeared from around a corner, his presence enough to silence them without a word spoken. When Margaret Sullivan made a pointed comment about Sarah's dress at the church social, Dalton somehow ended up standing right behind Sarah, his quiet, "Nice dress, Miss Whitmore," loud enough for Margaret to hear and bristle at the implied criticism of her own rudeness. He never imposed himself on Sarah's company, never presumed friendship or anything more. He simply existed in her orbit like a guardian angel who had somehow lost his wings and learned to walk instead. Sarah found herself looking for him, her heart lifting whenever she caught sight of his tall frame or heard his quiet voice. She told herself it meant nothing, that gratitude was easily confused with deeper feelings, but her heart knew the truth even as her mind denied it. One evening, as Sarah loaded supplies onto her wagon outside the general store, a wheel suddenly gave way, sending bags of flour tumbling into the dirt. She stood staring at the disaster, exhaustion and frustration welling up inside her. The wheel was cracked beyond repair, and she had no money for a new one. Without the wagon, she couldn't transport the feed her father's cattle desperately needed. Without the feed, the cattle would weaken. Without the cattle, they would lose the ranch. The spiral of disaster seemed to stretch out before her like a road leading straight to ruin. "That's a problem." She hadn't heard Dalton approach, but there he was, crouching beside the broken wheel and examining it with expert eyes. He ran his fingers over the crack, testing the wood's integrity, then straightened and looked at her with those impossibly kind eyes. "I can fix it," he said simply. "Got some spare oak planks at the ranch. Won't take more than a day or two." Sarah shook her head, trying to ignore the hot tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. I can't pay you. We barely have enough to keep food on the table as it is. Dalton waved away her concern as if it were smoke. Didn't ask for payment. Asked for the chance to help. He gestured toward his horse. Let me ride out to your place tomorrow, take measurements and bring what I need. I'll have you rolling again before week's end. Why? The question burst from Sarah before she could stop it. Why are you doing this? Why do you care what happens to me? Dalton was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the horizon where the sun was beginning its descent. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain, of memories he rarely shared. Had a sister once. Bethany, she was small, delicate, had a clubfoot that made walking hard. Folks in our town treated her like she was cursed, like her foot meant she was less than human. She never complained, never got angry, just kept trying to prove she was worthy of basic kindness. He paused, swallowing hard. She died when I was 16, pneumonia. But it wasn't really the sickness that killed her. It was the loneliness, the constant weight of being treated like she didn't matter. Sarah's heart clenched painfully. I'm sorry. Swore then that I'd never stand by and watch people be cruel to someone just because they looked different or struggled more than others. Can't bring Bethany back, but I can honor her memory by being the kind of person she needed someone to be for her. He met Sarah's eyes directly. You remind me of her. Not in looks, but in spirit. That strength it takes to keep going when the world's telling you to give up. That's rare. That's beautiful. No one had ever called Sarah beautiful. Not in her entire life. The word hung in the air between them like something fragile and precious, and Sarah felt something inside her chest break open, releasing a flood of emotion she had kept dammed up for years. A single tear escaped, rolling down her scarred cheek, and Dalton reached up with surprising gentleness to brush it away with his thumb. You don't have to cry, he said softly. Just let me help, please. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Dalton helped her load the salvageable supplies back onto the wagon and promised to arrive at her ranch the next morning. True to his word, he appeared just after sunrise, riding up the dusty path to the Whitmore property with wood planks strapped to his horse and tools hanging from his saddlebags. Sarah's father, Thomas Whitmore, was a broken man. Years of struggle and the loss of his wife had left him hollow, going through the motions of ranching without passion or hope. But when Dalton introduced himself and explained his purpose, something flickered in the old man's eyes. He watched Dalton work throughout the day, his skilled hands shaping wood and fitting pieces together with the precision of a master craftsman. By evening, the wheel was not just repaired but reinforced, stronger than it had been when new. Thomas invited Dalton to stay for supper, and to Sarah's surprise, the quiet cowboy accepted. Over a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee, Dalton listened to Thomas talk about the ranch's struggles, the drought that had killed off half their water sources, the rustlers who had made off with a dozen head of cattle last spring. He asked thoughtful questions and offered practical suggestions, never making Thomas feel inadequate, but instead treating him like a fellow rancher facing common challenges. Sarah watched the exchange with wonder, seeing her father come alive in a way he hadn't in years. When Dalton finally rose to leave, Thomas shook his hand firmly and said, You're welcome here anytime, son, anytime at all. Dalton began visiting the Whitmore ranch regularly after that. He came on his days off, helping repair fences, dig a new well, train a young horse that Thomas had been unable to break. He never asked for anything in return, though Sarah always made sure he had a hot meal and fresh coffee. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, and gradually, Sarah learned to read his gestures and glances as clearly as if he spoke in paragraphs. The town noticed. Of course, tongues wagged about the mysterious cowboy and scarfist Sarah, with opinions ranging from pity for Dalton's apparent charity case to cruel speculation about what he must really want from her. Margaret Sullivan made particularly vicious comments, suggesting that Dalton must be blind or desperate to spend time with someone so physically repulsive. But Dalton proved immune to gossip. When Margaret confronted him directly at the general store one afternoon, demanding to know what he saw in Sarah Whitmore, he regarded her with the same calm intensity he brought to everything he did. I see a woman who gets up every morning and faces a world that's tried its best to break her, and she refuses to break, he said quietly. I see someone who works harder than any two men I know and never complains. I see kindness that hasn't been corrupted by hardship, and courage that doesn't need to shout to be real. He paused, then added with devastating simplicity, "I see everything that matters. Question is, what do you see when you look in the mirror, Miss Sullivan?" Margaret had no answer for that. She turned on her heel and fled, her face burning with shame and rage. The story spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire, and opinions about Dalton and Sarah began to shift, at least among some of the townspeople. It was hard to maintain cruelty in the face of such obvious genuine care. Summer turned to autumn, and autumn edged toward winter. The Whitmore Ranch began to recover under Dalton's consistent help, with repairs completed and systems improved. Thomas Whitmore seemed to shed years of aging, his back straightening and his eyes brightening as hope returned to his life. And Sarah found herself experiencing emotions she had never expected to feel, her heart opening like a flower that had forgotten how to bloom. She and Dalton were working together in the barn one cold November afternoon, sorting through tack that needed repair, when the comfortable silence between them took on a different quality. Sarah could feel Dalton watching her, his gaze heavier than usual. She looked up from the bridle she was examining and found him standing closer than she had realized, his blue eyes intense and searching. "Sarah," he said, her name sounding different in his mouth than it ever had from anyone else. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen until I'm done, because if I stop I might lose the courage to start again." Her heart began to race. She nodded, setting down the bridle with trembling hands. "I came to Redemption Creek running from my past," Dalton continued, the words coming slowly but with obvious sincerity. "I'd spent 5 years drifting after Bethany died, working ranches from Montana to Texas, never staying anywhere long enough to form connections. Figured if I kept moving, the grief couldn't catch up. But it did anyway, always does." He took a breath. "I was tired. Tired of running, tired of being alone, tired of not mattering to anyone or having anyone matter to me. I came here thinking maybe I'd just work myself into the ground and be done with it all." Sarah's breath caught. She had suspected Dalton carried pain, but hearing it stated so plainly broke her heart. "Then I saw you," he said, stepping closer. "That first day on the street, when you stood up to Margaret Sullivan with your head high and your voice steady despite everything they were throwing at you. And I saw myself in you, Sarah, not the broken parts, but the parts that refused to stay broken, the parts that kept fighting even when fighting seemed pointless." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently touched her scarred cheek. "You saved my life without knowing it. You reminded me that surviving isn't the same as living, and that beauty has nothing to do with what's on the surface." Tears were streaming down Sarah's face now, and she made no effort to stop them. "Dalton, I love you," he said, the words simple and clear and absolute. "I love your strength and your kindness and your stubborn refusal to let the world make you cruel. I love how you talk to the horses like they're people, and how you always make sure your father eats before you do. I love that you see the best in people even when they've shown you their worst." His thumb traced the line of her scar with infinite tenderness. "I love this face because it's your face, and you're the finest person I've ever known." Sarah couldn't speak. Her throat was too tight, her heart too full. Instead, she reached up and placed her hand over his where it still rested against her cheek, pressing it closer. They stood like that for a long moment, the barn around them fading away until nothing existed but the two of them and the truth hanging in the air between them. "I love you too," she finally whispered. "I think I have since the day you stood up for me. I just didn't believe I was allowed to hope for something like this." Dalton smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face. "Then we'll hope together." He kissed her then, soft and gentle and reverent, as if she were something infinitely precious. Sarah had never been kissed before, had never imagined anyone would want to kiss her, but in that moment she understood that every lonely year, every cruel word, every moment of despair had led her to him, to the possibility of a life she had never dared to dream. The engagement announcement shocked Redemption Creek. Some folks expressed genuine happiness for the couple, having watched Dalton's patient courtship and recognized real love when they saw it. Others remained skeptical or outright hostile, unable to reconcile their prejudices with the reality before them. Jackson and his crowd made crude jokes about Dalton's eyesight, while Margaret Sullivan took to her bed for 3 days, claiming illness but really suffering from wounded pride. But none of it mattered to Sarah and Dalton. They moved through their days with the quiet confidence of people who had found something worth fighting for. Dalton officially quit his job at the Cross T Ranch and became a full partner in the Whitmore operation, working alongside Thomas to rebuild it into something sustainable. Sarah bloomed under the nourishment of love, her smiles coming easier, her laughter ringing through the ranch house like music. They were married on a cold December morning in Redemption Creek's small church. Sarah wore a simple dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her make, white cotton with careful embroidery around the collar. She carried wildflowers that Dalton had ridden out to pick that morning, frost still clinging to their petals. When she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she saw Dalton waiting at the altar, his eyes shining with unshed tears of joy, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was the luckiest woman alive. Not everyone attended the wedding. Margaret Sullivan was notably absent, as was Jackson and his crew, but the church was far from empty. Mrs. Henderson sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Sheriff Craddock stood near the back, his weathered face creased in a rare smile, and scattered throughout the pews were faces Sarah recognized, some friendly, some merely curious, but all present to witness this union that defied every expectation the town had held. The Reverend kept the ceremony short and sweet, speaking about love's power to transform and redeem, to make beautiful what the world called broken. When he prompted Dalton for his vows, the quiet cowboy took Sarah's hands and spoke in that low, steady voice she had come to cherish. "Sarah, I vow to see you as you truly are every single day we have together. I vow to stand between you and cruelty, to be your partner in every struggle, to celebrate your strength, and hold you through your weakness. I vow to love you not despite your scars but including them, because they're part of the story that made you who you are." His voice cracked slightly. "You've given me a reason to believe in tomorrow again. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to give you the same." Sarah's own vows were simpler but no less heartfelt. "Dalton, I vow to be your home when you're weary, your comfort when you're troubled, your joy when you're content. I vow to see your heart before your actions, to trust your intentions even when words fail us. You taught me that I'm worthy of love. I'll spend the rest of my life showing you that you were right to believe in me." When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Dalton lifted Sarah's veil with shaking hands and kissed her like she was air and he had been drowning. The small congregation erupted in applause, and for once Sarah didn't care who was watching or what they thought. She was loved. She was married. She was home. The years that followed were not without hardship. Ranching never was easy, and drought and disease and market fluctuations tested them repeatedly. But they faced every challenge together, Dalton's quiet strength balanced by Sarah's determined spirit. The Whitmore Ranch, now officially the Whitmore Cross Ranch, slowly transformed from a struggling operation into a respected enterprise. Thomas lived another 15 years, long enough to see 3 grandchildren born and to walk with his daughter through fields he had once thought would be lost. Sarah never became beautiful by conventional standards. Her scars remained, deepening with age rather than fading. But something happened over the years. People stopped seeing the scars first. They saw the woman who could gentle a wild horse with patience and soft words. They saw the rancher's wife who worked as hard as any man and harder than most. They saw the mother who raised children to judge character over appearance. They saw someone who had transformed pain into purpose and loneliness into love. And they saw Dalton beside her always, his hand finding hers in crowds. His quiet presence a constant reminder that the truest form of beauty lies in how we treat one another when no one is forcing us to be kind. Margaret Sullivan eventually married a wealthy merchant from Cheyenne and moved away, taking her cruelty with her. Jackson got drunk one night and fell off his horse, breaking his neck in a ditch outside town. The faces that had mocked Sarah in those early days gradually faded into memory, replaced by new people who knew her only as Mrs. Cross, the woman who helped found Redemption Creek's first school and who could always be counted on to sit with someone through illness or grief. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Dalton and Sarah sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. 3 dogs dozed at their feet, and somewhere in the house behind them they could hear their youngest child practicing piano with more enthusiasm than skill. Sarah's hair had gone gray early, and Dalton's face carried deep lines around his eyes and mouth. But when he looked at her, she still saw the same wonder that had been there on their wedding day. "Do you remember what you said to me in the barn that day?" Sarah asked, her hand in his. "When you told me you loved me." Dalton smiled. "Every word. Not likely to forget the best day of my life." You said I reminded you that beauty has nothing to do with what's on the surface. She turned to face him fully. I want you to know that you taught me the same thing. Not just about myself, but about the world. You showed me that one person choosing kindness can change everything. We changed each other, Dalton said simply. That's what love does. It transforms us into better versions of who we already were. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon and stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere in Redemption Creek, life continued its messy, beautiful, complicated dance. People laughed and cried, succeeded and failed, hurt one another and lifted one another up. But on that porch in that moment, two people who had found each other against all odds held tight to the truth they had learned together. Beauty lives not in perfection, but in the courage to be seen as we truly are. Love asks not for flawless features, but for authentic hearts. And sometimes the quietest voice carries the most important message, if we're willing to listen. Sarah leaned her head against Dalton's shoulder, feeling his arm come around her in an embrace that had become as natural as breathing. They had been laughed at, doubted, and dismissed. They had faced skepticism and cruelty and the world's insistence that love must look a certain way to be valid. But they had also been proven right. Not in dramatic fashion, not in ways that made the skeptics apologize or the cruel suddenly transform into saints. They had been proven right simply by living, day after day, year after year, building a life that honored what they believed, that every person deserves to be seen for who they truly are, and that the most radical thing we can do is love someone the world has declared unlovable. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Dalton pulled Sarah closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. No words were needed. They had said everything that mattered years ago, and they had spent every day since proving those words true. In the gathering darkness, with stars wheeling overhead and the earth solid beneath them, they sat together. Two people who had found each other in a world that tried to keep them apart. Two hearts that had recognized each other when appearances would have kept them blind. Two souls that had chosen again and again to see beauty where others saw only flaws. And that, in the end, was enough. More than enough, it was everything.